Hello, welcome to Historia.
I'm Kylie.
I'm Jamie.
We actually have an intro now. Like, I feel like we finally have our shit together.
Oh my god, it took how many years?
Like 2.5, but we did it. Wait, almost?
God.
No, not almost 3.
We started in 2020? 2021.
So almost 3?
Mm-hmm.
What the heck?
I know.
Time goes by really fast.
Coming up. Boy, yeah, because it started when James first deployed.
Oh, yeah.
And I
had
nothing going on.
Life is so different now.
It does. It goes by quick.
It really does.
Mm-hmm.
But we're here. And Jamie's going to make us sad today.
I am. This one, yeah. So this one I have held in my hand for a while now because I was trying to figure out a good time to study it because I actually saw this topic at a museum that I was going through. And so I was just like, when I saw it, I was like, the fuck, I didn't learn about this. I'm going to research it. So I did. And I was very sad. And I was like, this sounds exactly like the name that I would. And it's very devastating. So this week, it's going to be more of like a somber topic. So it is going to involve disease, death, and brutal violence. So I'm not going to go in like super detail about it. I don't know. We'll see where it takes me. But if this makes you queasy, I recommend moving on from this topic. But if you read the name of it, you should know if you can't handle this stuff, you got to take a step back. But honestly, topics like these are so important to learn.
Yeah, it's like the uncomfortable history is sometimes the most important.
Honestly, uncomfortable history is one of my favorite to learn just because
same.
I have a hard time with humanity.
Yeah.
Of just seeing how stupid people are a lot of times, especially when you see it in social media with our generation. And looking back in history, like seeing how it's morphed into more online now, but back in the day, it was just flat out brutal. And I just find that very interesting because I love the sociological aspect of it, but also the psychological. But that's the kind of history I enjoy researching, even though they are very hard. Like a lot of people can't handle this kind of stuff, but for me, I can.
Those are like my favorite museums.
Exactly.
To just like take it all in because you really feel the emotions and like everyone around you is quiet. Like the 9/11 museum was very much like that. It was like everyone around was very quiet and you just kind of let it all.
I did not take any pictures or videos when I was in that museum because I felt uncomfortable to do it. Because I was like, why would I take pictures here?
Right.
I just want to read. I'm a reader when I go through museums, and the museum where I found this one, I read everything. But when it came to the 9/11 museum, I read it all. Like my husband had already been there before, but there was when we went there were some things that he hadn't seen before. But
the hidden wall, that was crazy.
Yeah. But they have like a whole section which is for its more mature content. It was when the planes actually hit the towers, and it went into like detail about like the missing posters that went up and just like the debris and all the stories.
There's like stores that still had this stuff.
Yeah. And then actual like footage of stuff, and it was very chilling.
Yeah.
And I appreciated it. Like
for sure.
It grasped me in. I was just like, holy shit, there's so much that I did not know. They did an amazing job at this museum. Like I thought the curators and everybody involved in this museum did a phenomenal job. They did amazing work. It was very well detailed. Like everything that they had on display was very well put together. The verbiage was very clear. Like it was very well done. And I was looking around because I love people watching. And of course you have the younger crowd and stuff. They were like taking pictures, taking videos. And I'm like, this is not the time nor the place to be doing this.
I never feel comfortable doing that.
I'm like, this is just one of those museums where you just experience it and take it in, and you know that you have that knowledge. And I feel like with a topic like this is one of them where when I was doing like my research and stuff, I was like, do I really want to look at photos of these people? Because I know exactly when I was doing my Nazi concentration camps one, that was a hard one to get through.
Yeah.
Because just the pictures and the footage of stuff that I have seen, because I love watching World War II like in color, just videos and stuff like that. It's very hard to watch. Yeah. And for this one, when I was doing like my research, I was like, God, I can't imagine. This is the reality of humanity.
What is it?
So I am going to be covering a part of reality, an event during World War II. So specifically, I'm going to be talking about the Bataan Death March.
Oh.
Yeah, it's not very well known.
There's a whole museum for it?
No. So I went to the World War II museum that we have here in Colorado Springs. Amazing. It's like part aviation for planes that they actually refurbish and restore from World War II.
Oh, okay.
They have like a whole section where they do the whole refurbishment, and then they have a whole area too of just World War II museum stuff. It is so well done. And I saw this like kind of, it goes through like the whole part of the war, and it brought up the Bataan Death March, and I was like, I didn't learn this in my World War II class.
Yeah, no.
But then again, there were so many instances like this that happened in World War II that you're not going to learn in one class. And so when I saw this, I was like, I'm going to research that. That appealed to me. And I was like, I want to know what happened, because that kind of shit is scary and it's sad. And I want to know more, because I want to know what part of humanity caused this, or what people were thinking going into this.
I'd never even been to this museum.
It's so
I really need to go.
Yeah, it's awesome. I want to take James because he was really upset when I went without him. And I was like, oh, it's awesome. We'll go next time, because I could definitely keep walking this one, because I'm sure there's stuff that I didn't see. But so I'm first going to go over where I got my information. So I pulled info from the National World War II Museum of New Orleans website, army.mil, which was really helpful. I specifically looked at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in that. And then lastly, I pulled information from the National Museum of the United States Air Force website.
Okay.
So they were all very helpful into guiding this. So as we start to better understand the significance of this death march is to understand where the history starts. It all has to come from somewhere. So those involved in this death march were Filipino prisoners of war and American prisoners of war. And they were held by the Japanese soldiers during World War II. So this was during the Pacific Theater. Woo! Very brutal.
Yeah.
Now there might be confusion on where the heck the Filipinos were doing with, like, what were they doing with the U.S.? Like, how does this like correlate with one another? Well, these two nations go way back, late to like the late 1800s. So Spain, since the 1500s, were occupying the Philippines, because they were like, y'all have some good shit. We're going to like stay here. And during the Spanish-American War, the Filipinos are like, well, we want Spain out, so we can fight with the Americans and help them out to be like, beat the Spaniards and Spanish, like, you can help us out. And of course, like, the US was like, oh yeah, we totally will. So little did they know, though, the Philippines, that the US was just as selfish as Spain and would go to take over the nation after the war. Leading to the 20th century, many Filipinos fought the U.S. in their occupation as they wanted to be a country of their own, respectably so. But other Filipino citizens decided to take the programs the U.S. provided and use it to their advantage. So it was pretty much split half and half. Some were like, yeah, this is fine, we'll do whatever. And the other half were like, no, we were occupied by Spain for so long, we don't want this anymore. So I get it. So one of these programs, though, was to enlist into the U.S. Army. So that was one of the programs that you're able to do. So within the Army, it would then be established for the Filipinos in a program called the Philippine Scouts. So they were pretty much guided into this section of the U.S. Army. This training was tough, and those involved found it to be elite and took very good pride into it. They were very strong-headed. They loved it. They're Very proud to be a part of it. So with tensions on the rise in the late 1930s and the start of World War II, the U.S. decided that they needed to take some action without involving themselves in the war. Because, during this time, they were like, we're not getting involved. We are not being a part of that. Y'all handle it yourselves. We're isolationists. Knowing that the Pacific was stirring with trouble, the U.S. Army in July 1941 would go on to create the U.S. Army Forces in the Far East. This would be also known as USAFFE. So pretty much they wanted to keep an eye because they knew that something was going on with Japan, and they were like, this isn't going to look good, especially what was going on with Japan and China. At this time, there was a lot of conflict. They even say that this war was starting way before Hitler, which I agree.
Yeah.
So they just wanted to keep an eye, and the Philippines was like their safe space for that. So involved would be around 100,000 Filipinos, and roughly around 20,000 Americans would be a part of this program. So everything, though, would change on December 7th, 1941. After the attack at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would officially enter into the war in the Pacific Theater. That's brutal. The U.S. entered into the war, and it was then put into place by the Army that the USAFFE immediately start their mission to push against the Japanese. So it was like straight ahead. All of those that were deployed there, like, it's go time, baby. Their primary objective would be to make sure that Japan would not take the position of the Philippines. That was like their one area that they had to hold.
Yeah.
And it was getting hard to do so. So before Pearl Harbor, the group they were doing everything to keep Japan at bay from the Philippines, but that all changed after Pearl Harbor. They're just like, shit, we're really going to have to like fight now to keep the Philippines. And Japan was like, yeah, you guys are done. Not only was Japan fighting back harder now, as they were more confident with hurting the sleeping beast that was the U.S., because they had all of that just hunger and power after taking down Pearl Harbor. They're like, we can do anything with the U.S. And that was scary at this time. So they were ready to push forward in the Pacific. They're like, we're going to take over the Pacific. Just you wait. With the U.S. entering the war all over the world, this also meant that rations would also have to be divvied up now. The one in charge of the group that would lead the troops into the Battle of Bataan was General Douglas MacArthur. He promised that as the men who were ready to fight, that more troops, planes, and food would arrive. Unfortunately, this was too good to be true. With more men being sent to the Pacific daily, and even though those who are being sent to Europe, rations would become harder to come by, especially in an area that was starting to be swarmed by the Japanese Imperial Army. Like, Japan was taking the Pacific quickly. It was just, you could, if you see like a map of just how fast they were doing it, it was just like, mwah.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So it was by March 1942 that most of the Pacific would be held by the Japanese. That was all except the Philippines. The U.S. did not plan to go down with a fight for the nation, though. They're like, nope, they can't take this, because if they do, we're screwed in the Pacific. And I don't think a lot of people who know about World War II know about the Pacific Theater and how brutal it was. Like, Europe was one thing, but my God.
Yeah.
The Pacific was another. Like, it was tough. Mm-hmm. Like, one TV show that I loved watching, like, I love Band of Brothers, but God, the Pacific was so good. It's so sad, but it was so well done.
It's called The Pacific?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's on HBO Max and I think Netflix.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I highly recommend you guys watch that.
Yeah, sounds good.
So MacArthur had a plan for this group that they hold the ground on the Bataan Peninsula and Korger Island in the Philippines. Now, they would need to hold onto the area until the Navy could come in and provide supplies, troops, and weaponry. Like, this is what they needed to keep going. With this support, they could push towards the north and have the power to take the Japanese little by little. This was the plan. This is how they had it all figured out. This sadly would not come to plan with the lack of ships that they could provide to do such because of what happened at Pearl Harbor. And I mean, the U.S. was trying to build as much as they could, but Japan bombed their most reliable ships. Like, they knew what they were doing, and it really hurt the U.S. in the long run in the Pacific. Like, it was brutal for them. So instead, the Japanese Navy would take this area that they planned to keep. So instead, Japan would come in and it would prevent the U.S. from obtaining like any supplies and troops. So what they had on that island was it.
Okay.
They had to figure it out. So this would be the start to the hell the men would go through. With Japan blockading this area, months the men would have to live off the rations and supplies they had. It also did not help that the scorching heat would get to the men. Now, in the Philippines, it gets very humid and very hot. I'm guessing most of these American men did not grow up in this climate. Yeah. They probably grew up in Brooklyn and California and in the friggin' middle of the country. Like, this is not something that they're used to. Yeah. Most of these men did not grow up in a climate like this. This is a huge change. Like, they were not familiar with this type of atmosphere. Yeah. And this is like a big problem with the Pacific, is that with Europe, they understood, like, Americans understood the type of climates that they were getting themselves into. Of course, they were still having issues with like frostbite and whatnot, but they didn't know how it was in like a forest or like a tropical forest, very like different. Rainforest. It's very different. They didn't know how to handle it. Yeah. Like, you're just gross all day long and your pores. Ugh. So by April, many of the men were struggling with extreme weight loss, and disease started to become rampant throughout the camps and throughout the entire areas. Like, disease was just going to be a common thing. The American men were out of their element. It was starting to become clear that this was not going to end well. With their lack of supplies, malaria was really bad. Makes sense. Yeah. Dysentery, because don't have fresh water. Yeah. So everything is gross, and it's going to contract a bunch of bacteria and diseases. And there would be also other diseases that would start to become a leading cause of death. At this point, there are about 10,000 men who were confined to hospital beds. Wow. Just in these first couple months. Yeah. It was pretty crazy. Jeez. And of course, they only had only so much supplies that they could provide, and there's no antibiotics probably that they had. There was very minimal supplies that they could go with, so you're pretty much just waiting.
Can't be that many doctors either.
Yeah, exactly. The worst was still yet to come. This was just the beginning. Jeez. On April 3rd, 1942, the Japanese would push for their final attack on Bataan. So as the only soldiers who could fight were those well enough, Filipinos and Americans, so those who were not confined to hospital beds were fighting. And the Japanese had the upper hand in this case because they had healthy new troops and they were familiar with this area. The men would fight for a total of 6 days. So constant back and forth. God. More men were dying during these battles. It was not looking good for them. But eventually it became too much. General Edward King would go on to make these surrender on April 9th. He's like, we can't keep doing this. We're losing way too many men. He just could no longer see his men get slaughtered and live this kind of life. Yeah. He's like, those who are dying of disease, they're going to end up dying anyway. And I'm seeing all of these men get slaughtered. I can't lose every single man. There's well over 20,000 Americans and 100,000 Filipinos fighting for us. And we're losing them left and right. So little did he know that this was on the climb to hell they would endure. As the men surrendered, they would quickly become prisoners of war. So the Japanese Imperial Army would come in and take control of their camps, or where they were pretty much setting up. And they were like, we got you. And they started off by separating everyone into groups of 100. So there were roughly 60,000 to 80,000 men who would be taken prisoner at this time. That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And there were 4 guards to every 100 men. It was then put in place that they would be taken to a camp. So even though there's only 4 guards to every 100 men, these men are not in good shape.
Yeah.
They're already losing a lot of weight. They are tired. They are hot. They are contracting some sort of disease.
They're like just hungry. Trying to survive. Like,
yeah.
That's their focus.
Yeah. And of course, like being taken prisoner by the Japanese was terrifying because you're just like, I don't know what they're going to do to me.
Yeah.
They're going to ask me things that I don't have answers to, and they're going to kill me. That's exactly what they're going to do because they don't care. So the camp that the men would have to march to would be Camp O'Donnell in Tarlac. The men would start the treacherous 65-mile walk.
Wow.
Yeah. This would be no easy walk. Already, men were starving and sick with unfamiliar diseases. It only got worse when some of the men who tried to escape, fell, or even tried to get water would be instantly shot or bayoneted. Because that was a really big thing that the Japanese had with them. They had their rifles, but they also had their swords with them. And, oh, God, it was really sad in some instances that I didn't put in my notes, but I just remember reading is some of the Japanese soldiers for fun would pretty much put a rope around a soldier's neck and like attach it to the car and just drag him.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And they would just do it for fun.
Oh.
Yeah. It was fucking crazy. And then anyone who tried, like any locals who, when they're on their walk, just pass by them, if they even so much as like tried to give them like water or food, they would be killed.
Wow. Oh, yeah. Geez.
Anybody like, so if you just like fell and tried to like get back up, they're like, nope, you're not going to make it. And so they would instantly kill you.
Oh my God.
And if you were thirsty and try to go get like water, dirty water that was just off on the side of the road, they're like, nope, you're dead.
I'd probably rather die.
At that point, yeah.
Kill me.
Yeah, it's like, I'm not going to live through starvation and brutal.
Oh, God.
A 65-mile walk that like, I don't even know if I can make it. That's so I'm like, insane. Just kill me in the beginning. I would much rather not live at that point. Especially the men who made it to the end. I don't know how they could survive all that. I'd be like, just kill me. I hope my next life is better.
Right.
So little was offered to the men during the march. So it was becoming more common each day that men were dropping like flies. So it took them a little bit, like a few days to get to the camp. But of course, like men were dying because they couldn't make the march because they were so malnourished. They probably had some sort of disease, and then a lot of them were just being flat out murdered for tripping up a little bit. So 5 days would test you if you could survive the first round of being a prisoner of war. So it took them 5 days. So along this march, it wasn't just the Filipino Americans that were getting out of turn. So yeah, the civilians would be also killed, which was really devastated. It is estimated that roughly 7,000 to 10,000 men were killed during the march.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So that's a lot of fucking men just dead on the side of the road. There is no exact way of knowing how many there was, as there was no record kept of who died. So pretty much if you knew if your significant other was in the Philippines during this time, if you did not hear from them, they probably died during the death march. So it's just, I'm sure there's probably bones still somewhere in the Philippines of these soldiers somewhere. Yeah. As the groups arrived to Camp O'Donnell, it was evident that it was going to be a tight space for these men to fit in. The camp was only supposed to hold 10,000 men, but they were occupying 6 times that amount.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's about 60,000 men in this camp, and it's only supposed to fit 10. That's crazy.
Oh my God.
With this large sum of men and little space between them, it was a matter of time that it would start to become a problem like it did before they surrendered. The heat was unbearable as it made the whole place smell terrible from lack of hygiene and there being no proper plumbing.
Wow.
They literally just had to shit in the middle of the road if they wanted to.
Can't smell good.
No. Probably smelled fucking awful. God, yeah. I'd be throwing up all day.
Yeah.
This would also cause issues with the lack of water and the men drinking anything they could. So they were drinking water that probably had shit in it. That's how you get dysentery and die.
Yeah, no, I'd rather die.
Yeah.
I'd rather be dead.
I'd rather be dead. The disease would begin to start rampant through the camp as well. There would start to be 400 deaths per day.
Oh my God.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't until July 1942 that it was decided by the Japanese commander of the camp that they split up. Like the camp, they're like, this is not going well. And I'm pretty sure their men were probably dying too because they were being surrounded by all of these sick people, malnourished. Yeah. Like they were not getting like any food either. So, I mean, they probably look just so like skeletons. I don't even know how you come back from that. And I mean, it was the same with the Holocaust, is that even the people that they found that were still alive, they still ended up dying because they tried to eat so much that their just body couldn't handle it. And so they ended up dying anyway. And I'm sure it was the same in this situation.
Oh my God.
So the American prisoner of wars would then be sent to Camp Cabanatuan. So back at Camp O'Donnell, the conditions were still poor, but there would be an eventual change for the Filipino prisoners of war. So in September 1942, until the new year, the Japanese decided to slowly ease the men out from the camp, so the Filipino population. But it was not given to be an easy get out of jail free card because they just couldn't keep affording. They took so many prisoner of war in.
Yeah.
That they're like, we don't know what to fucking do. Like,
right.
What do we do with all of these men? And so with the Filipinos, they're like, okay, they're on their home turf. We are going to let you be paroled, but you have to give a sworn oath to not participate in the guerrilla warfare of the military, or of like the whole war.
Yeah.
And if they do, they would be killed on the spot. So they would constantly, like in their little villages and stuff like that, they would constantly have Japanese soldiers going around and like doing pretty much like paroles. Of just like, or patrols of just checking to make sure that no shit was getting out of line. And if you even did one like little slip up, like if you talk back to one, you're dead. Simple as that.
You really can't do anything.
Literally, like you're being watched 24/7.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, you can go back to your family and you can go back home and do like your own thing, but you have to swear. You have to give this oath that you are not going to participate in any of like American or any like enemy like warfare.
Yeah.
Like you're done and we're going to keep an eye on you. And they even said that their families and those of like their town would also be held accountable to make sure that none of that activity would go on. And if they did, they would be murdered for allowing them to do such. So not only would you be murdered, but your family members would be murdered. Anyone close to you, even your village, would be murdered for having any role of what you did. So you could not be out of line. So that was like, it was still like a prison that you're being held into.
Yeah.
But they're like, we just can't keep you anymore because there's too many of you. So you can go home, but we're keeping an eye on you. And they had enough men to do that. So it was very unfortunate. Like they got out of it, but they were still under so much scrutiny for that.
Oh my God.
So, and I'm sure plenty of them still died because they were just like, I can't stand this. And those who, there were still prisoners. There were still some that would be in the camp. So this camp would be open for 8 months. And in this 8 months, there would be a total of 26,000 deaths of the Filipino soldiers.
Wow.
So a lot of them probably were the ones that just went against them that died. And then a majority of them were the ones who died from all the disease that was going on until they separated the camps and stuff like that. So all the ones that they kept letting out of like the camp that didn't even take into consideration how many were still in the camp because they were dying. So a lot of them didn't get to go out because they were so sick. Oh my God. Mm-hmm. Over in Camp Cabanchuan, it was not better for the American men. They got really the shit out of the stick when it came to it, which makes sense. The camp was handling the disease rate better because as there were doctors to help prevent the spread of disease, so they actually had doctors at this camp. But conditions were still very poor, and that was not the end of the American prisoner of wars. They were still having to deal with this shit like every single day. Like there were still men dying, they were still malnourished. Like it was really bad. But as the U.S. started to infiltrate the Philippines in 1944, so we really see like in 1943 a turn in the Pacific theater. Like the U.S. finally got their shit together. They finally had a few wins of their own, and they're like, okay, we're going to keep pushing forward. So they started to, back in 1944, they started to push back into the Philippines. They're like, we're going to take this back, and then we're just going to start taking everything, and then we're going to hit Japan. That's the plan. And they started to push forward. They finally had enough ships. They had enough aircraft. They started to build up their army. Because at the beginning of the war, these men, there wasn't a lot going on. They didn't really have that draft of men yet. But the war has been going on for a few years now, or about like 3 years for the United States. They finally started building up the population of the army, getting these men over. They got the Marines, they got the Army, they got the Navy. They got them all coming in to help now, which they didn't have. They started to get more rations, support. And so they started to actually turn around and really start to push in the Pacific theater. And the Japanese were like, okay, this is a problem. We got to move these men because the U.S. is coming into the Philippines. We can't have this. We're moving them to Japan and China. So they did not want to give up on these men too easily. They're like, we took these men as prisoner of wars. We're not going to just let the U.S. have them. Like, they're going to do work for us. So they had an idea instead. The U.S. still had yet to make it to Japan and Manchuria, so that is where they would be sent. Gathering up all the men who were still alive enough, they just left the ones who were like dying or on their deathbed.
Oh my God.
Yeah, they're so like, mm-mm. The Japanese army would force a prisoner of war onto cargo ships. Now, these ships were crammed to the brim with these prisoner of war. There was no space for the men to sit. Food and water were barely given, and the restrooms did not exist, so you had to go right where you were standing. Yeah, it did not smell good. The heat was so hot, men were passing out from heat exhaustion. Some even suffocated to death because they were just so crammed together and there was no air. Like some actually had to like climb above these men to get air.
Oh my God.
Yeah. To make matters worse, the bodies would be left to the smell. The bodies that died would be left there.
Oh.
So the smell got worse. And it took a couple days for the ships to like make it to these camps.
Why didn't they throw them off?
Because they don't fucking care.
That's true.
They're just like, we're not going to touch that.
Like,
it probably
you watch that.
Ridden.
You stare at it while you're dying.
Now, the ships that were heading towards Japan were also unmarked, and this was like a huge target for American craft, like aircrafts and like other ships. They're like, okay, that's definitely like a Japan ship. Like it's unmarked, but it's going in that direction. Like that's a Japan ship, and they didn't know what was in it. They didn't know who or what. They just thought it was just Japanese soldiers that were in these cargo ships. So some of these ships would be targeted by American troops, and in the process many of those being moved would be targeted, and the prisoner of wars in the ships would die because they would drop bombs and shoot like cannons and stuff like over to those ships. So like the US were bombing those cargo ships. And so those prisoner of wars were dying.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So, and they didn't know. Wow. Because they can't just be like, hey, what's in there? They can't just like hit them up over like radio, be like, hey, what do you have in there?
Yeah.
So they just...
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah, so it's like your own people killed you.
Oh my God.
But it's like...
But they didn't know.
They didn't know. It was really sad. So when arriving in Japan, those who survived... These men have been surviving since they've been captured. They would instantly be put into slave labor camps.
Wow.
So this slave labor was between working in the coal mines or the factories. There would be an increase in deaths upon arrival from the malnutrition exposure of the elements as well. Yeah, and the coal mines are no fucking joke. Like, you are carrying shit around constantly. If you watch Unbroken, the movie, that is like a glimpse into the slave labor camps during being a prisoner of war for the Japanese Imperial Army. It's devastating. I mean, these men had been a prisoner of war for how long? And now they're being sent to slave labor camps.
Yeah. There's no, like, light in sight.
They've been doing this for, like, over 2 years now. Ugh. I don't know how you could do it.
No.
Now, the slave labor between working in the coal mines or the factories, there would be about 2/3 of the American prisoner of wars would die in the hands of the Japanese. It would not be until 1945 when Japan finally surrendered after the bombing of 2 cities, atomic bombs, that the men would finally be liberated. The Battle of Bataan and the Death March were 2 very prime examples of the harsh reality that is a part of war. This was only one example of the endless camps and mistreatment that the cost of lives of soldiers during World War II. The men who did survive were never the same again. Many went on to have PTSD from the trauma they witnessed, and many survived up until the very end because their bodies could no longer take it. So when they're finally liberated and they just fell back, and some of them just died of exhaustion and just everything.
Jeez.
Mm-hmm. So I cover these topics as it sets a reminder of how disturbing humanity can be, but also the resilience of those who fought until the end. There was a good chunk of men who kept fighting.
How? Like, honestly.
You had to have you had to be telling yourself something.
Yeah.
To just encourage you. Yeah. Because just the brutality, I'm sure the abuse, the malnutrition, the disease, just everything you went through, and then coming home, going through PTSD that no one knew existed.
Yeah.
At this point. PTSD wasn't really acknowledged until after Vietnam.
That's so crazy.
Yeah. So you have these men who are going through all this trauma, and people are just like, what the hell is wrong with him? Mm-hmm. And it's like, when you know the trauma that they went through, especially these Filipino troops too, of just the hell they went through, it makes sense of why you're going to have a tough time afterwards. But of course, no one understood.
Yeah.
And this is the type of trauma and PTSD that occurred during World War II that was very evident for a lot of men. And they all these soldiers have different variations of PTSD that they went through, but the Pacific theater is just a whole new level of trauma. I feel like it was crazy. Like, it's just like, I'm sure a piece of bread just made them happy.
Yeah.
Which is so sad.
Yeah.
So we see that the Filipino and American troops surrendered in the end, but it was not all a total loss. So Japan wanted the area of Bataan in 50 days to work with their plan and like really expand a lot quicker. But the USA FFE held them off. So it would take Japan 99 days instead to get to where they wanted, which in return prevented Japan from taking over that much quicker, which could have been an overall lasting effect, or it might have made us harder to get to them.
Yeah.
So I hope learning this event will get you to look a little more into these smaller occurrences or just these brutal realities of World War II, just to look into more of them, to understand of just like, okay, this happened. Are we really learning from it? Mm-hmm. So, boom. That's the Bataan Death March. Yeah, it was a very somber topic to research. I was very sad reading all of it, especially the brutality of it all.
Yeah, that's rough.
Just the fact that even civilians who tried to help, they're like, nope, you're dead.
Oh my God. That's a rough one.
Yeah.
It's so sad.
But hopefully we can learn something from that.
Yeah. It's important to know about.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how painful it is to hear.
I mean, the Trail of Tears was no different.
Oh, yeah. That one's...
I want to cover that one because...
Yeah.
I fucking hate American history, but that one is... You got to know about it.
Mm-hmm.
So, where can you find us?
Well... You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at History of the Podcast, or email us at historyofthepodcast@gmail.com. And yeah, we're going to have a palate cleanser next week.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry today was sad, but again, it's important. We're not going to shy away from that kind of history.
Oh, I have a real brutal one, but I'm going to hold that one in my pocket for a while.
Okay, yeah, give us some time to process this one. But yeah, happiness is coming for the next few weeks.
Yeah.
So thanks for sticking with us and hope you learned something today.
We'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Bye.